Welcome everybody to ISAS seminar. We have today Sri Raja Mohan speak to us on India's military diplomacy from isolation to partnership. Raja does not need much of an introduction. He is one of the finest minds we have in India today to analyze strategic matters and India's foreign policy. He is with ISAS these days as a visiting professor, and the rest of his CV you can see inside. I didn't know what exactly he is going to talk, except that yes, he will be dealing with India's military partnership from what he says as non-existent to an engaging one. We will therefore first listen to him and see what are the aspects you want to interact with him. Raja will speak for about half an hour, and then we shall have discussion.
Thank you, Professor Mani, for that introduction. First I must explain myself about this strange topic because it's the purpose, I think, of what we're trying when we're talking about India's military diplomacy is to explore what kind of military relationships is India seeking with the rest of the world, and what is the purpose to which its increasing military power is going to be put to. Because we've had quite a bit of debate about the rise of China and India, what kind of powers they will be, what kind of a role they'll play in the international system, responsible stakeholders and all the other stuff. But there's less of a debate in terms of what kind of military powers will China and India be. What is their understanding of military power? How will they use this military power to achieve their national security objectives? So it's in that, and military diplomacy is really one subset of it. And since it's an underexplored theme, I'm really grateful for the ISAS for giving me this opportunity to work on this topic. And what I look forward to is really to feedback from all of you. Because just as India's military diplomacy is work in progress, this project too is work in progress, and I look forward to getting feedback from you, and that will enrich the further pursuit of this project. To begin with, I think many of you might say military diplomacy is an oxymoron. The two are actually don't go together, much like military. Just as military intelligence exists, I suppose military diplomacy too exists at this point. But generally, I think most people see military and diplomacy as being at the two ends of a spectrum, where diplomacy is the first line of defense and military is the last resort. But the relationship between the two is not entirely linear, and I think those of us who heard of gunboat diplomacy, that these are not exclusive domains, that actually your diplomacy is more effective when you have military power to back it. And as the old adage goes, to speak softly but carry a big stick. So the two things are not completely different, and in many cases they are related. And the coercive diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy is not something that has disappeared with the colonial age. Those of us who are following what's happening in the Western Pacific in the last 2 years, the conduct of very powerful military exercises in the last few years by the Chinese, by the Americans, by everyone else, tells you the story about how military diplomacy is being used to pursue specific political objectives. In terms of the definition, I think then what is military diplomacy? I think we can stick to a fairly simple one, which is the use of armed forces in operations other than war. And if you're one of those military types, what abbreviations OOTW, I mean, that's what they use at the operations other than war, that the use of military, short of war, the use of the military as an instrument to pursue national objectives. That is the broad gauge definition. And sometimes military diplomacy and defense diplomacy are often used interchangeably, while military diplomacy refers to specifically the uniformed people, that the defense diplomacy, you could say, that the civilian establishments, the R&D establishments that are associated with the Ministry of Defense, how they get used to pursue specific objectives. While in appearance is a fairly simple one, but it is a particular context that this particular idea has gained traction. It's come from Britain and Europe, where when Europe got into this do-good mode, say at the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, this idea they must help other countries reform their security sectors. Here the experienced masters are going to come and teach the others to improve themselves. So this idea that, look, the military now doesn't have to fight the Soviet Union, that it can do other things, useful things, like reforming the security sector in Eastern Europe, and all those other terrible failing or falling states in the developing world. So it is in that particular context that this notion of military diplomacy as a specific activity of the Western world was conceived. But then if you break it down, this is really not new. I mean, I think military diplomacy as operations other than war has been used by great powers for a long time before. Whether it is interventionary operations, whether it is constabulary functions on the oceans, whether it is humanitarian relief and disaster management. You have a range of things, military support, military education. US has had an IMET program, International Military Education Training Program, that started at the very beginning of the Cold War, one of the most massive exercises of the American engagement with the rest of the world's military. So this is not entirely new in a sense, but it is about using military for purposes short of actually using force. How do you put them to use? So the question then for us at this point of time is that until now these functions we talked about, the humanitarian intervention, the disaster relief, or the protecting the sea lanes, power projection into conflict situations, has largely been done by the Western powers. The question today is, could China and India be doing the same? Because if you look at the defense budgets, I think India is close to overtaking Britain, I think, one of these days. In any case, Britain doesn't make many ships, they're shutting down what they have. India and China are building big navies. If you project the current defense expenditures of China and India in the next 10 to 20 years, I think they'll just be behind the United States. And China could go across with the Americans having problems. Chinese defense budget could overtake the American one in the next 20 years, and the Indians could be somewhere in the third position. But the fact is, sure, while we discussed all this in the economic side, there's been very little projection on the military side. So the wealth always produces power if you know how to do it, and that the accumulation of the economic wealth of China and India, some of that, even a small portion of it, gets translated into military power. What these two countries are going to have is going to be pretty substantive, and that the question then becomes how do they use this military power? What I'm going to do in this presentation is really to look at how this transformation of the accumulating military capabilities might translate into specific policies of India. We're not going to get into China, but only specifically about India, and how India thinks about its military diplomacy or its external military engagement, and how this runs into some of the existing principles of India's worldview, and how the tension might actually get resolved. One of the changes that has taken place in recent years is this notion of India as a security provider. India as a net security provider. This phrase was first used by Robert Gates, US Defense Secretary at the Shangri-La conference here, but maybe 4 years ago. Since then, it has become part of the catechism in the Pentagon documents, in the QDR, in the annual reports. So this is the standard phrase when it comes to India. There's one paragraph: India is a net provider of security in the Indian Ocean and beyond. So that's the. But yesterday we had Nancy Powell, the new ambassador designate, using the term India as a net security provider in the Indo-Pacific. It's a much bigger region than just the Indian Ocean. That I think that should make it somewhat interesting to Southeast Asia, that if India is a net security provider, after being the consumer of security all these years, what does it mean for this region? I think that will be an interesting question. And more interestingly, India's Ministry of Defense has begun to adopt the same phrase. It tells you that if you use a phrase again and again, somebody's going to pick it up. And that the power of the Pentagon then actually constructing, shall we say, of a new reference point, and it gets absorbed by the Indians. Mr. A.K. Antony himself has used this phrase recently, that India is a net security provider in the Indian Ocean. Now, but this image is certainly new for India, that India is a net security provider. Because the general image of India was, look, we are always fighting with the Pakistanis, and we're kind of trapped in our own little muck in the subcontinent, and that Indian military capabilities had no consequence for the rest of the world. But that image has steadily changed in recent years, and I think that in a sense, as India's capabilities grow, that what it can do to the rest of the world today is beyond the subcontinent, so therefore there is some interest. I think Singapore is particularly an interesting story to tell here, because when Singapore became independent, it came to India and said that, look, could you help us build our military forces? Of course, we never replied to that letter, and eventually, I mean, typical Delhi's style, that we actually, Singaporeans went to the Israelis and the training and all that they got. So in the mid-60s, then, India was, I think it was Lee Kuan Yew's famous phrase, that is a big tree that doesn't give any shade. That you had the capabilities, it was the old inherit of the Raj, but what you could do for others was fairly limited. Now the question is, if India is now a net security provider, is that going to change? Now here I think the fact is today, well, Singapore was denied cooperation in the mid-60s. One of the first agreements of security cooperation we signed in recent years was actually with Singapore in 2003. Now there's a fairly substantive defense cooperation relationship with Singapore, including Singapore gets access to Indian territory, the Kalaikunda Air Base where they do Air Force exercises, they get to use Indian territory to do artillery firing exercises, and India comes to Changi, Indian Navy comes there quite often. So there is, actually Singapore is a major defense partner for India. So in a sense that tells you the transition that's taken place in the last few years. According to one count at least, today India has defense cooperation, MOUs, understandings, agreements, whatever you want to call them, with close to 50 countries. For a country that's imagined as non-aligned, that it is quite something seems to have happened in the last few years, that military diplomacy has become very much a component of India's engagement with the rest of the world. And what I'll try and do is look, what does these agreements mean? How do we make sense out of these agreements? Can we draw some broad strands of patterns in this and to draw out their implications? But to know where we're going, and we need to know where we're coming from. And unless you know something about India's past, the recent past where India was not interested in military diplomacy, to a slightly more distant past, the colonial past, the past where the British Raj was the guiding force, that India had a very different approach to use of military diplomacy and military force. As in so many other things, that if you don't understand the colonial period, what the Raj was doing in the subcontinent, you might not be able to fully understand what India has done in the subsequent periods. So I want to divide my presentation here in the military diplomacy into three parts: the legacy of the British Raj, then the Cold War period where India became isolated by choice, and the more recent period where India has moved towards partnership. Now, if you go to the question of the Raj legacy, when people compare China and India, as in so many things, but when it comes to the armed forces, we come from very different places. The Chinese armed forces are relatively new to the world stage, that they don't have a record of being part of the modern world in the way that the Indian Army is, and that the Indian Army goes back a fairly long period when India was involved in military operations, military diplomacy. India means United India. It was involved in security, diplomacy, security operations in this part of the world. Now, the three legacies of the Raj, I think, which remain relevant in one form or the other. One legacy of the Raj is the expeditionary tradition of the Indian Armed Forces. That before the Americans showed up in this part of the world, it was really the Indian Army that went and bashed up whoever we thought were the bad guys or the failing states, or that the use of the Raj sitting in the center of the Indian Ocean largely used the Indian Armed Forces as a security provider, shall we say, and as a stabilizing force, as a protection of regimes or ouster of regimes, depending on where you are. That this function was largely done by the Indian Army since the late 18th century. And in fact, I was looking at the first expeditionary operation by the Indian Army, 1762, when they sailed to Manila to beat up the Spanish garrison out there. They sailed from Madras. It was the first expeditionary operation led by the East India Company soldiers, but the soldiers are mostly Tamilian, from Madras. That the Madras Brigade went and beat up the Spanish and came back. That was the first operation. But if you look at those whole of the 18th century and the turn of the 20th century, from Egypt to China, there was not a place in the Indian Ocean littoral where Indian Army didn't go. In the Boxer Rebellion in China, in fact, the repeated British use of Indian Armed Forces in China. Those of you read Amitav Ghosh's new book, The River of Smoke, we were very much part of the Opium War and did a lot of nasty things the Indian Army did, which some Chinese don't forget yet. But the fact is, irrespective of what purposes it was put to, the fact was that the Indian Army was an expeditionary force at that point of time. The second legacy of the Raj was that it created a security system for the smaller states around it. That the Raj built the glosses, if you want more contemporary terms, think of it as near abroad for the British, that to secure the Raj, the United Subcontinent, the Raj had to create a structure, a threefold structure around it, including the creation of buffer states, protectorates, and a whole range of military treaty arrangements of using military to protect the glosses that was built around the subcontinent. Equally important, I think, was the whole question of tribal warfare. Today you talk about special operations, which is the big thing for the American Armed Forces. But if you look at the American colleges today, what are they reading to understand the longer history of it is mostly the experience of the Indian Army in Afghanistan and around the subcontinent, where the first attempt at fighting against irregular forces. Much of that experience was accumulated in the subcontinent by the Indian Army, and that experience today, whether it's Anbar uprising in Iraq or whether how to deal with arming a few tribals in Afghanistan, that the rich experience of Indian Army of using different forms of methods, the Chitral Scouts, or the PIFers, the Punjab Police Force, or the Assam Rifles, or using a range of military forces, including recruitment of the locals, fighting one section of the tribes against the others, that this perfection of this whole art of what today the American Special Forces do, is largely built on the Indian Army's experience, and some of it was used in this part in the Malayan, putting down the Malayan insurgency by the communists in the middle of the last century. So therefore these three elements, I mean the expeditionary tradition, providing security to the small states, and the tribal warfare, the special operations, these three legacies, how do they relate to the current situation? Before we go to the current situation, there was a reaction against all these in the period of the Cold War, where India became independent and non-aligned, where given the nationalist opposition to use of the Indian Army for colonial purposes, that the reaction to it meant that India was not going to support any use of, the use of Indian Army for imperial and colonial purposes, and therefore that the reaction to that set in, and then you had in the 45 to 47 period, when British were actually using Indian troops, many of the nationalist leaders were coming to Nehru and saying, look, why is the Indian Army being used against us? So it was fairly clear that Nehru decided that, look, as we chose the path of anti-colonial solidarity, the proto-non-aligned movement, that India was rejecting the use of force by its army, and that one of the first things we do is that India was not going to do what the British Raj did. And then it fitted into the whole notion of non-alignment, separation of military blocks, because standing away from military blocks was the central notion to non-alignment. And therefore, it became critical that, look, India was going to detach itself from any kind of military adventures in the world. So therefore, the period of then non-alignment and the Cold War period, we saw that India steadily detached itself. Because we were part of the Commonwealth, and there were naval exercises within the Commonwealth of the coast of Sri Lanka till 1964. They were called joint exercises off Trincomalee. The Navy was the last one to be detached. And finally, after 64, India wouldn't do any joint exercises with the Commonwealth. Many Southeast Asian or Australian friends thought we were really a kind of pawn for the Russians because we were great friends of the Soviet Union. But with the Soviet Union, though we had a treaty arrangement, India would not allow any service-to-service interaction between the Indian Army, Indian Armed Forces and the Soviet Armed Forces. Bias yes, technology yes, but no service-to-service interaction. So the whole period we saw India consciously, deliberately cut off military interaction between the Indian Armed Forces and the outside world. And related to this was what in India we call the jackboots of civilian control. That the Indian bureaucracy determinedly, purposefully ground the Indian army into dust, of removing their military, any kind of political role or policy role, after seeing what the army was doing all around us, in our own neighborhood, with much support from the West, that the civilian control of the armed forces became so strong, exposing the armed forces to any foreign contact was considered a bad idea, and that we generally shut off military contacts with the whole world. But there were two exceptions to this whole isolation that took place in the Cold War period. One was the UN peacekeeping. In fact, if you look at the record, India is one of the largest contributors to the UN peacekeeping since the end of the Second World War. And in fact, it's not just India. Our friends in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, if you put us together, sometimes the Norwegians come and tell you they do a lot of stuff. But actually, it is really the four countries of the subcontinent together account for more than 60% of the world's troops that have been used in the peacekeeping. Where do these troops come from? And it's not as if we didn't have problems in our own domestic. We had India and Pakistan have had problems, India, China have had problems. This, I think, can be traced back to the fact that the British created a military surplus in the subcontinent, and that surplus was available beyond our own quarrels and fights that we had to be deployed for collective good at the international level. So therefore, the peacekeeping thing showed some continuity, because of course it was, India was not going to unilaterally send them to any particular place, but the fact that it was done under the UN showed you that there was a military surplus that was created. The second exception was, of course, we were very non-aligned and non-use of force and all that stuff in the rest of the world, but the subcontinent had different rules. As our friends from our neighborhood will tell you, that what we did for the rest of the world is different from what we do in our own neighborhood. I think of it as a near abroad, but the rules in terms of India has used force, India has intervened in the internal affairs of neighboring countries. Right now there's a whole debate going on Maldives, what we should do or should not do, or what we have done in the last 2 days. So this again goes back to the Raj legacy, that the providing security to the small states within the subcontinent was considered a very much part of the Indian legacy. Therefore, that is different from what we say in the UN and in the other multilateral fora. So these are two separate realms. But these two exceptions actually prove the rule that while shutting down some of the legacy of the Raj continued. That brings me to the last part in terms of what we've done since Cold War. That we've seen a dramatic expansion almost within a year of the end of the Cold War. Here we had no contact with American military forces except for a brief period in the Sino-Indian conflict in 59 to 62. That within a year of end of the Cold War, India and US were beginning to do joint exercises, the so-called kick-lighter proposals. And in the last 20 years, we've seen a dramatic expansion of India's military cooperation, service-to-service exchanges, joint exercises, purchases. In fact, between 1947 and 2005, India didn't buy a single military platform from the United States. But since 2005, we bought at least 4 major ones: ships, aircraft, transport aircraft, and from zero, defense trade has gone up to $8 billion in the last 7 years. And there's going to be a lot more in the pipeline. So you see a sudden engagement with the United States. And once you do with the United States, of course, after that it was easier to do with Japan and the friends of the United States, the allies of the United States opened up for military engagement with India. And once we did this with the US and its allies, we also started doing with the Russians, the French, and the British, the engagement with all the major powers of joint exercises, doing various things together, that has dramatically expanded in the last 20 years. The second aspect of the expanded military diplomacy is the recasting India's neighborhood treaties, security system. We talked about the glasses that the British Raj built, Government of India after independence tried to preserve. Most of these treaties, as people would say, the Nepalese will tell you, is hegemonic, or our friends in Bhutan might say the same. The fact is, India has recognized that, look, you can't sustain the old hegemonic treaties, and that you need to revise those treaties. We've seen that first of the treaty being revised. We saw that happen in 2007, when India-Bhutan treaty has been revised to bring it to the contemporary level, removing the unequal provisions, but retaining a security partnership on a more equal basis. What's happened in the last few, in fact, just in the last 1 year, 2011, India signed 4 new security partnership agreements in the neighborhood. One was with Afghanistan, the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which explicitly talks about military cooperation, which we never did before after independence. Is the framework for cooperation agreement with Bangladesh, where there are references to military cooperation. We've just begun to do that. In fact, last few years there's been more exchanges with Bangladesh. And with Maldives, just actually in November, we signed an agreement, maritime security, a whole range of other cooperation with these are treaty-like structures that India has created. So what we're seeing is a transformation, rejecting the old, but creating a new framework, more equitable, but nevertheless security cooperation with India's neighbours. But the biggest expansion has been in the so-called extended neighbourhood, with special focus on Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean, the African coast, the Gulf, Central Asia. So you see a huge amount of new military cooperation agreements that India has signed. Now, most of the cooperation we've done in these places is not limited to the bilateral. India also participates in some multilateral security forums. Because India was traditionally very finicky about multilateralism when it came to security. Multilateralism we preach, of course, but when it comes to security, like all major powers, the fear that a multilateral forum can constrain India's freedom of action, just like the United States, multilateralism where convenient, unilateralism where necessary. Something similar, but on a lower scale, of course, that India was ambivalent about the multilateral institutions. But what we've seen in the last 20 years is now India's participation in the ASEAN Regional Forum, the more recent ADM and Plus, that we're beginning to engage forums in a more proactive manner. And we're also setting up our own multilateral forums. For example, India set up the Milan exercises, now it's almost 20 years old. Every 2 years in Bay of Bengal, we hold joint naval exercises with the Southeast Asian countries. Right, we had one just last week, where Singapore has been a regular participant, and many other Southeast Asian countries. And recently, India has also taken initiative to set up a Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, somewhat modeled after the West Pacific Naval Symposium, but brings in naval chiefs from the whole region to sit down and talk about a future cooperation. Now, I just conclude, I think with just, while the activity is expanded, the scope and structure of this engagement has dramatically risen in the last 20 years. There are many political problems, I think, without resolving which, I think India's effective contribution as a security provider is going to be limited by the unresolved political disputes that remain. And I'll point to just 5 of these ambiguities in India's mind at this point that constrain and limit what India can do in terms of whether it can contribute to public goods in the security realm, whether it can help the smaller, weaker states, whether it can provide security to the region. The first tension, which is in Indian mind, is between the notion of strategic autonomy. Indians will puff up when they say strategic autonomy. It's supposed to be the ultimate code word that this is your signal of your independence and autonomy. How does that notion square with military partnerships with a bigger power like the United States? At what point does partnership become a junior partnership? Or at what point do you cede your freedom of action to a larger power? So therefore, there's those who, and then given the US is always a tough love to deal with, given the nature of that relationship, the question of how far does India go with the United States? Well, we've gone very far in the last 20 years. It still remains a contested terrain in the domestic politics. And even within the Congress party itself. We had 2 defense ministers in the last 8 years, and each one of them had his own different approach to this issue. So it's a pretty politically hot potato in terms of how you think about your relationship with the US. And in the military realm, that remains a tension. The word interoperability. A lot of Indian politicians, if they're particularly on the left of center, they're going to jump. Interoperability, Indian Navy going to be taken over by the American Navy. This notion that, look, when Americans, of course, come with the boxes, interoperability, but for the Indians, it kind of looks like you're being subsumed under one single operational command. So therefore, the word interoperability is a taboo. Then there is the broader problem for India. On the one hand, it sees a rising Chinese power, which you can only constrain by working with another power. But you're afraid of getting too close to the United States because you don't want to lose your autonomy. So how does India deal with this structural situation where you want to retain your autonomy, but you need partners? But how do you manage this, especially in the military domain, That remains a huge problem that Indian political classes are still struggling to deal with. A second tension, I think, is between the notion of territorial defense and the emerging new global interests. If you look at the last 50 years, I mean, India's armed forces have largely been about protecting our own borders. But India becomes a global economy. It's almost, if you compare its imports and exports together, the total trades, is part of GDP is now close to 40% or so, or even more. Now, that's not a small figure, and that most of India's energy comes from outside. So now, are you going to limit yourself to securing your borders and guarding the Himalayan frontiers? Or do you say, look, my interests are way beyond, then you go back to the Raj proposition that, look, India's interests are not limited to the subcontinent, but are Aden to Malacca, Suez to South China Sea. All the Curzonian terms that have gained popularity, you see some of that being repeated. But the fact is, it is still a problem for the political class. While a section of it repeats this, the question is, should India send its troops to do something beyond its territory? That notion, because of the isolationist period, is still one of pretty difficult one for most parties to still absorb and to, if you talk about power projection, I mean, you'll have a whole lot of Indian political leaders say, look, we're not in the business. But your capabilities are actually going in a direction. Look at the aircraft that India has bought, C-130s. C-130s moves troops, large number of troops over long distances on even a dirt port tracks. India has bought Trenton ship, which is essentially LPD ship, which takes troops from one point to another point around the Indian Ocean. C-70, again, So what you have is, on the one hand, your capabilities are moving in the power projection dimension. But your political rhetoric is still, we are small boys, we don't want to get into this, we are pure, we're not. So that tension still remains to be sorted out. A third one is that if India's interests are global, that means to secure them, India has to have forward presence in the Indian Ocean at least. Now, if you want forward presence, I mean, you can't fax a navy. You still need to have physical locations where you pick up fuel, relief and resupply, coaling stations of the old. Therefore, you need to get bases, the bad four-letter word, which in the Indian political lexicon, all these years we said Americans should have no bases. All countries with foreign bases should get out. And if you have a base, you're not allowed to be part of the non-aligned movement. From that kind of rhetoric against bases, does India acquire its own bases? Because the Navy calls it turnaround facilities. It's a nice little word. But the fact is, you still need, if you're sailing all the way down to, get your people out of Lebanon, Operation Sukoon in 2006, you still need to pick up fuel from somewhere. You need special political arrangements to ensure that your forward operations are successful. Or ask the Americans to, share some of the fuel with you somewhere on the high seas. So the nature of the relationship, then your logic of your forward presence demands a certain set of actions, which is in clash with your larger political philosophy or of no basis, non-alignment, that sort of stuff. The fourth tension, I think, in India's thing is that while we join multilateral institutions, India is like the United States. I mean, you feel more comfortable in your own multilateral organizations. That is, you don't want to be part of somebody else's multilateral organization, so therefore you do your own Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, your own Milan exercise, you set the terms, you set the agenda, then you are multilateral. But you're not sure that India has not set the ASEAN on fire by its participation in the ASEAN Regional Forum or ADM as well, that basically we take the back seat and keep quiet. But that we're setting up our own multilateral institution. There is a contradiction in terms of how does your security regionalism work? Are you prepared to be part of a coalition, or is it too big to be a part of a regional institution that will limit your freedom of action? I think that tension needs to be resolved. And the last tension in India's thinking is, do we participate only in the UN mandated peacekeeping operations? Or do we join occasionally a coalition of the willing? Now, India has participated in a few coalitions of the willing, very small ones, the tsunami relief at the end of 2004. But the backlash has been pretty quick, that if India actually joins with the United States and says, look, we're going to do something tomorrow in Sudan or somewhere else, that a large part of the political class is going to say, look, what the hell are we doing? We must stick to the UN mandate. In fact, that's already a political debate. But when you tell them, look, UN mandate means China has to give you permission to do what to do with your military, do you want that? But we've not thought through this. I mean, that we say UN somehow is a neutral, non-political, non-American mandate that will somehow it's less evil than using force on your own. So therefore, I think that tension now, when do we use force? The real debate has not really started. When should India use force? Under what terms? Under what conditions? For what purposes? That we've not addressed that question, and I think till we address that question, I think what we created is a massive infrastructure template in terms of the arrangements and agreements. But the question is, what is the nature of India's doctrine in terms of use of force, and how does it work with others? And these are unresolved issues that need to be sorted out in the India's military diplomacy. But I think this is work in progress. But I'm a determinist in the sense that China and India, I believe, will eventually do whatever they might be the current rhetoric. We are nice boys. We are, nicest things in sliced bread. We don't hurt anybody else. We're non-intervention. But the fact, I think, the logic of the circumstance is going to demand more assertive military policies because the interests are global. The capabilities are growing. My sense is eventually China and India certainly, will have to go down the path of using military to secure its interests. But the question is, how do the logic of your position and circumstance coincide with the logic of your politics domestically? I think it is that friction that's going to endure for quite some time to come.
Thank you. Thank you, Raja. I think starting from the British legacy, you have put enough on the table, which can keep us busy for quite a long time. I'll throw the discussion open to the House. We'll take questions in batches, 2 or 3, if you want, so that we can finish early. And then you will respond, we'll have another batch. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you would say a little bit more about the thinking and debate surrounding India's possible entrance navally into the Pacific, and to the question of whether India should be a little bit more like Indonesia, which has moved away from very close association with the U.S. to some more intermediate position, and whether India is in danger of occupying a position that the Indonesians have rejected, and whether the Indians leadership feels that the greater danger is antagonizing and provoking China on the one hand by moving into Pacific activities, or if the greater danger is tempting China with apparent weakness by seeming passive as the Chinese move more into the Indian Ocean. And I would think that there would be some realistic assessment of the possibilities of retrieving an Indian flotilla that entered into the Pacific. That is to say, sending it is one thing, getting it back is really quite different, isn't it?
Yes. Mr. Raja, I just want to know what is your take on India's recent decision to acquire the French Rafale fighters, and the fact that 2 major US bids were dropped last year. Don't you think was it a deliberate decision by India to purposely stay away from acquiring very highly sophisticated US platforms?
Okay.
Yeah.
Roger, just follow up these questions. From what you described, it's quite clear that India, for whatever strategic reasons it has got, is now at a phase that is preparing the ground, building up strategic partnerships, the networks, the agreements, for the next phase, which means that you mentioned forward bases, because forward bases are important for any operations in naval military operations. Because profiling naval presence, that's one thing. Exercise is one thing. But the point of war, you need forward bases, like you mentioned that. Do you see the next phase will be a more concentration on getting forward bases like Vietnam or other places in South China Sea?
So these three will take it.
I think I'll take the second question. I think when you have a government which is, which is reacting to 20 years of paralysis on the corruption issue, and says, look, this is a technical issue, and I don't think it's a technical issue, it should have been a political issue, how we decide this. But you have a defense minister who says, look, I want this above board process, it's going to be absolutely no favors done for anyone, and that also means there's no strategy. And then you tell your Air Force, the flying boys, we thought the top collar button is always open, the flight of pilots. And you tell them money is not a problem, relationship is not a problem. Here are 160 parameters, technical parameters, how beautiful it does the turn, and what it does. You say, okay, these are you feel free from a technical perspective to decide which is the best aircraft. So F-16 and F-18 have had no chance in such a selection process. They had only a chance if there was the logic was an Indo-US strategic partnership, defense industrial base, long term we can entice Boeing or Lockheed into India. And that was the only argument they could have got. Technically they were much inferior aircraft. And then you have the Europeans, Gang of Four, trying to sell something. The French are always better at this thing. So I think it had nothing to do with that. Once you decided it was going to be a technical process, I think the fighter pilots decided. Now the real negotiation will begin with the French in terms of what we can squeeze out of them and a whole lot of other things. So India is not going to abandon that. They're going to squeeze the French for all it's worth. The second, I think the first question, I think that's the central dilemma for India in the Pacific. And the fact is India has been showing its flag in the Pacific, in the South China Sea since 2000. The first aircraft carrier came in 2005. So every 2 years, India does a fairly significant amount of exercises, both bilateral, trilateral with Japan and the US, and then that it's been a sustained showing of flag for the last, I would say, 10 to 12 years now. Now, we have not reached a point where you will have to choose. That is, that you, at what point would you be provoking the Chinese? Now, that test case came in a relatively low level with the Vietnamese, for example, on the contracts. At the recent summit in Jakarta, where Punjab asked Prime Minister Mohan Singh, what are you doing in South China Sea? We tell them what they tell us exactly on Kashmir, what they do in Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Oh, we are here only for commercial purposes. But the fact is, we are drilling, we are sticking around. We think we still some room to go where the contradictions we pointed out will actually measure. So at this point, I think India is conscious of the fact that Vietnamese can play us, that you shouldn't get too dragged in without thinking about this into a fight with the Chinese when you don't want to fight. But at the same time, India also has to show that it has other options. So at this point, I think we're playing all sides, which is a good strategy at this point. But the choice will have to be made at some point in the future. And that, I think we're not there yet. But that moment will come. And that depends on the nature of the US-China relationship as well. And I think our game is very different from the Indonesians. I mean, it's completely different. I mean, Indonesia is part of ASEAN. Both of us have the old non-aligned smell to us. But I think we think about it very differently in practice. So I don't think we're taking their role or we're taking anybody else's role.
Is there any concern that the US is going to move closer to China and
of course there is. No, that's the point. No, exactly. The G2 idea.
India will be hung out to dry.
Precisely. That's the point why India is not going to rush into an embrace. But that's exactly what's going on. That is, that any day they can cut a deal. So therefore, I'm not going to put myself out there as an American pawn against China. No question. But that's why when we stand with Americans, we say they're natural allies. We stand with the Chinese in BRICS, and we say, look, we are for a multipolar world. So, I mean, it's not as if India is just going to surrender its options so easily to it. On the forward presence, I mean, I think at this point, it's not the age of Mohan in terms of we need a physical access of a kind that we used to need. That what the Americans are devising systems now, lily pads, moving through facilities, prior arrangements. While physical locations are important, the US is not going to go back to a, Subic Bay type of an arrangement with Philippines. Or it is, other day, Singapore Prime Minister said, look, if you have to give the Americans a base, it has to be bigger than Singapore. I think it's going to be a more technical, small-scale arrangements that I think India is negotiating with a lot of countries. you know, all across, I mean, from east coast of Africa to neighbors, island states in the Indian Ocean to this part of the world. So that I think will continue. But ultimately, it is, you're not going to present it as a, you know, as a base of the old style debate, because in any case, in large countries with nationalist feeling, like Vietnam, is not going to give bases the way they did, you know, the way they did before to the Russians. So it has to be a different set of arrangements, and that there has to be mutual benefit. It has to be organized in a completely different form. But I think the logic that, look, you still need to stick together a radar in Mauritius to see, the Navy has a nice name for it, maritime domain awareness. So you want to get domain awareness, you've got to stick radar someplace, you've got to keep satellite stations somewhere else. And this structure, Chinese are doing it, India is doing it, Americans have always done it. So that stuff will go on. But the big base, the Subic Bay kind of stuff, I don't think we're going to do that.
Next set.
Raja, thanks. Wonderful presentation. Really raised some great issues. I want to just ask to sort of pick up on one of the larger points you're making, and then ask two more precise questions related to that. The question of strategic autonomy has often been sort of glossed as really saying the inability to make choices. You know, or it's, in a sense, one is autonomous because one doesn't make choices. And one could argue that a lot of Indian decision making follows that pattern, as you have pointed out in a number of cases. And I'm wondering whether the kind of picture that you paint might be facing a couple of very important challenges soon. And one of them is the question of force mix. Because you started saying that, okay, India has started, you know, purchasing the kind of military equipment it's going to need for this sort of presentation, but underlying that, of course, is going to be an inter-service struggle between the Air Force and the Navy. And clearly, the kind of Air Force that we've imagined for a long time is not appropriate to the kind of task that you're talking about. And clearly, the kind of Navy that you are going to need for what you're imagining is not yet in place, and still maybe looking for the wrong kinds of equipment along the way. So one is, can you say something more about that? Has this kind of thinking permeated down to the extent where now among the services, this kind of battle is taking place over budgets and over the appropriate force mix necessary for this kind of picture that you're painting? And the other question, of course, comes right out of, you know, current affairs, as it were, the Maldives, which you started off by mentioning. What do you think India not should have done, but if we are to be consistent with the larger picture that you're painting, what should have India done immediately as soon as we heard what was going on?
Dr. Chaudhary?
As always, a very stimulating presentation. Now, Professor, you made these three watershed points: colonial, Cold War period, three phases: colonial, Cold War, contemporary. Now, would one be right in saying that the policy differences that you discern as these stages emerge is a function of equipment or procurement or the nature of weaponry rather than of policy? In other words, for example, the policy is, okay, one has to condemn China. China has a budget of 9,700 billion. You have 36, 40 billion. You procure those equipments, and this idle capacity is there. From conventional, there is a jump to strategic capability. Therefore, with changes in capabilities, the nature of policies also automatically change. Would one be right in saying that? So we have a situation where procurement is driving policy rather than the other way around.
Yeah, my experience is that when you're talking about India, the number one issue on the agenda is always Pakistan, no matter what you're talking about. And I wonder if you could try to elaborate a little bit about this. Is India able to look beyond Pakistan when taking a position in a global environment, or will it always be this regional thing which is there? And in that connection, Kargil has something to do with that, the Kargil incident. Did that change the position of India, in fact?
Yeah, I think on the strategic autonomy, look, I think like in all countries, you know, there's a slogan which requires a life of its own. I think it's an outdated slogan, I mean, purely from my analytical perspective, because strategic autonomy is for weak countries or middle powers trying to protect others from setting the rules for you. that you don't want to be constrained by the rules that the big boys are setting. But the point is, if our logic and our projection is, look, if Indian economy is the third largest economy, and we'll have the third strongest military in 20 years down the road, autonomy from whom then? What are we talking about? That the transition, I think the problem is that until now, the strategy has been to prevent the dominant powers from constraining your space. When you say I wanted freedom of action, strategic autonomy. But as your condition changes, then the relative distribution of power produces, then I think it is India which will have to be part of the gang that writes the rules. It's happening in some cases inadvertently purely because of science and global warming. That if India keeps building power plants, carbon coal-fired power plants, then it's not a question of autonomy, there is a question of responsibility. And there, do we take responsibility or not, that's a different debate. So I think as India's weight changes, I think the old debate on autonomy is not sensible. The question is then, how do I write the rules? That until now, I had no role in writing rules. But now, some places they're offering it to me half, some places they don't, some places they will. So the question is, how do I take I want to sit at the table. Then sitting at the table is only one part. Then you ought also to enforce rules, which is the military power. That then, do you use military power to do other things? But I think that is transition that is yet to take place. But I think that debate is on.
May I add a small point? Is it true that the question of strategic autonomy becomes far more sensitive when it comes to relating with the US rather than anywhere else? Of course, the power difference is a part, but really is the backlog or the baggage of the past in terms of experience, in terms of several attempts to link up with the US and failure in doing it. Does it loom anywhere?
I think so, but I think it's largely only used vis-a-vis the US. It's like, nobody in India asks, look, show me the agreements you signed with the Russians on nuclear cooperation.
That's right.
But in the US, every little thing we do with the US is a public debate. So there is a past.
No, therefore it is rooted into the experience and the kind of dealing India has had with the US, rather than the power differential or anything.
So the thing is that ultimately, look, it's not a real question of strategic autonomy. It's a question of your record and your relationship in the past. But you saw what Nehru did finally, that when you finally confronted with the situation, you go to the Americans and say, look, send me 2 squadrons of Air Force now. So it's all right to, there is a domestic posturing that goes on. But because the articulation of India's options in power terms are not normally done. Like all democracies, you frame it in this high-sounding principles. Then there's always a bit of a problem of relating it to the actual power situation. So the second, I think on the equipment question, look, I mean, I didn't want to go into that at all, because I mean, that's a different order of the problem. That those problems will be there, and as you see in the US, never-ending terms of who gets what and how, whether it actually relates to larger goals. That fights will go on, but I didn't want to get down to that level of the argument here. On Maldives, it's still, in these kind of situations, you never know the full facts. It's only not even 48 hours since things have happened there. But it looks like India is supporting the new guy pretty clearly. I'll just give you one example. I mean, yesterday, the first statement the government of India put out was, it's an internal matter. Then we had the press, I mean, having been in the press, there's obviously been a government briefing which said, actually, we've kind of helped them manage the transition. So you're caught in this thing of saying...
telephone call.
No?
Then PM called.
PM call, telephone.
So I think the fact, I think like a contradiction, you talked about US and China, that when it comes to the neighborhood, I think India has to find that conscious balance between pushing itself and trying to move things, or stay just far enough so that you're not accused, you don't become the issue in an internal crisis. How to find that right touch? And the Americans will say, welcome to the club. I mean, this is what happens to us all the time in Latin America or wherever. But I think we're struggling to find that balance, and I think that balance is, hopefully we're moving towards that a little more today than we were 10 years ago, of working with institutions, don't identify yourself with individuals, deal with whoever is in power like the Chinese do. But that debate is, again, and I think on the Pakistan question, on the equipment, I don't think equipment drives, bureaucrats are too powerful in India, like the generals are powerful in Pakistan. The political framework still remains the dominant one, and it is really you talk about the equipment, the political equipment is the principal problem, I think, in India in terms of what it defined, whether it was the colonial, the immediate post-colonial period, or now. Most of the problems of today are a question of how do you relate your power and
the
principle.
equipment is strategic today, the policies have to be strategic. Is that it?
No, I'm saying that equipment is secondary, that it is a question of Indian political class deciding what its worldview is. How does it relate to its own changed weight in the international system, and not the. On Pakistan, look, Pakistan is always going to be a problem. But I think what's happened in the last 10 years, and I think here the other experts will tell you, look, the gap between Pakistan and India is increasing in some interesting ways. That previously the whole image of South Asia was India-Pakistan, locked in a permanent conflict, nuclear weapons, stability, instability, paradox, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that the Pakistanis today can't keep up with the idea of an arms race on the conventional side. It no longer holds because Pakistan can't keep buying, we're now even buying from the Americans, except someday we'll buy from the Chinese, then Pakistanis are, someday we can tell the Chinese to sell us arms, at least purely for monetary reasons. Now, I think the Pakistanis are not trying to compete with us on conventional arms anymore. They're trying to send them the nuclear stuff. They're trying to do other things. So this idea that there is a balance, a parity between the two is changing because the economic weights are. There's also the nature of the great powers relationship with South Asia has changed. Today, US is selling arms to us. They don't want to sell it to Pakistan. Everybody else sells to us. We try to block as many people from selling it to them. So I think Pakistan's condition is changing, and I think Pakistan also has other fish to fry. I think for the next 2 to 3 years, hopefully next 10 years they'll be occupied in Afghanistan. God bless them, they can take charge after the Americans. I think the context, the image of India-Pakistan as a dyad, as a symmetric dyad, I think that's going to change because a lot of things have changed in the region, and India is more and more focused on China these days. But that doesn't mean Pakistan problem has gone away, no. It is still there.
It's still an Indian policy, that's what I mean.
Keep it cool, manage it, because you're not going to win that war because they've got nuclear weapons. If we can tempt the Americans to do something, unfortunately we've tried it, it's not working. If the Americans can go and take out Pakistani nukes, someday we say, please, all strength to your elbow.
Thank you. Talking about the policy dilemmas, Raja, towards the end of your presentation, one has more and more the feeling that this policy dilemma is being solved in one way by the people connected with our defense ministry, particularly the uniformed services, in terms of their policy prescriptions, and in another way by the so-called political class, which includes the Ministry of External Affairs. I was wondering, given your experience, both as a professor of international relations, as also as a journalist, would you care to comment on that? My second question relates to Iran, and there we see already a clear difference emerging in terms of policy between the United States, which sees Iran from the point of view of a Middle East policy, whereas India looks at it from the point of view of oil, as well as the role in Afghanistan. And that will also be a very interesting situation.
I'm glad this last question was asked.
Just
Sorry.
No, it's Mr. Chair.
No.
Okay. Okay. No, just as I could throw two thoughts. Do you ever see the possibility that India and the SAARC region will form the combined armed forces in a similar fashion to NATO? You mentioned that India's rules for playing in the near abroad and at home are slightly different. So India can take the lead and say to Pakistan, Bangladesh, okay, let's form a unified force and we act as a one on the global stage. Is that a possibility? And the second point I just want to explore with you is that India has a few regiments of Gurkha troops, which they've taken from Nepal. Now, in recent years, Nepal has just had a Maoist government which doesn't believe that sending troops to serve in other people's army is acceptable. How do you think this is going to, how will that affect the Indian-Nepalese relation?
you asked for it? No?
No, I was talking about, there is a philosophy a few years ago which was very active. It was called the Indian Ocean Rim countries, which stretched from Iran, the west of Africa, east of Africa, and even, and the Australians also claim that we are part of the Indian Ocean. And there used to be a very active movement, actually, led from Singapore by the late High Commissioner for Sri Lanka. There were several sessions which I had the pleasure to attend. It was a very active thing. The Iranian ministers used to come. The two countries, the subcontinent, Bangladesh and Pakistan, on this issue always used to get together to hammer India. But it was very diplomatically replied as a big brother that India had no more ambitions towards any of these things. It's the protection of the sea lanes that we're talking about. I wonder what happened to that issue.
I think the civil-military relationship, I think it's a pretty central one in India. And in fact, we have the opposite problem of Pakistan, which is where the military runs everything. In India, the generals run everything, the joint secretaries run everything in Delhi. So I think the three levels of the problem, and I think there's the professional military, then there is the civilian bureaucracy which runs it, and the political class. I think we have a serious problem in terms of relating, harmonizing all the three to move in a single direction. I think that is partly one reason why today India can't take full advantage of its military diplomacy. For example, it doesn't have the capacities, the bureaucratic capacities, that with 40 agreements to service every year, hundreds of joint exercises, you have two guys in the Ministry of Defense and nobody in the Foreign Office to actually say, look, how do you schedule these things, how do you service these various things? And that's a huge problem. And there's a bigger question of capacity in India, administrative capacity, whether it's in the police service, IAS or foreign service, that we need to, in the security sector, we need to dramatically expand our capabilities to be able to cope with the demands that are coming at India from the rest of the world, and to even implement what we promised so many people. Like many in ASEAN will tell you, I think you can send a message to Delhi, can go months without anybody even bothering to reply to it. It's not because they don't want to reply, but the fact is there are just too many messages in the inbox to clear. So I think there is a serious structural problem, and that's a big constraint for India, and I think how soon it will reorganize it. That's only, one is the capacity issue, second is the relationship between, we still don't have an integrated structure, which was forced on the Americans, which was forced on Britain. We're a long way from creating that integrated headquarters where you can actually bring in a comprehensive thing. And I think the dominance of the IAS will always limit the possibilities in many ways in that. But I think it's only a crisis that might force eventually for us to do things. Iran, again, I think it's an important issue. The problem is not easy to argue with the Americans when they're made up their mind. We tell them, look, what you do with Pakistan, you say, look, Pakistan is fine, and Pakistan supports terrorism, Pakistan is killing your own boys, but you're still nice to them, and you tell me Iran is beyond the pale. But I think we've gone beyond the stage of fighting on principle with the Americans. Say, look, don't pick a fight, you can't win. So the question is, how does India finish this? There, I think the primary consideration is not the amount of oil dependence. It is really domestic politics. Because every morning, a US Senator stands up and says, is India with us today against Iran? Equal number of editorials and politicians in India are going to say, look, who the hell are these guys to ask me that question? So the posturing for you have 150 million Muslims, you have a domestic argument in terms of is India selling out to the Americans on Iran? Though actually there's very little going on between India and Iran. That we get 12% of our oil from Iran. Saudi Arabia gives a lot more. And what's happened in the last few years, actually, last 2 years certainly, it is the Saudi-Iran conflict is far more deeper. And the Saudis have been quite willing to tell the Indians that, look, we can replace quite a bit of that. But how does the politician get this across? Given the long tradition of on issues relating to Middle East is best ducked rather than try to confront those issues. So I think that is the problem, because structure, otherwise in actual practice, this can be managed. I think our stakes with the Gulf Arabs are so high now. UAE is our third largest trading partner. that the GCC is one of the biggest economic partners, and the 6 million workers, $40 billion of remittances a year, 70% of the oil comes from the Arab Gulf. So what are we talking about? So if you put it on a scale, I mean, Iran is a political augmentation between CPM, left, and but on the ground, it is the Gulf Arabs. So, and that's why we voted with the Gulf Arabs in the latest resolution against Syria. Was because the stakes with the, you're not going to oppose a resolution that the Gulf Arabs. But as long as the Americans don't get this point that, look, if Saudi Arabia tells us it's much simpler to get it done rather than the Americans hectoring us from there.
Iran may also be affected so far as Afghanistan is
In fact, more than oil.
Yes, I think
I was
that's-
wondering whether it's domestic politics in India which carries greater weight, or are we going out on a limb for Iran because of Afghanistan?
We want, I mean, what is it, Afghanistan is another issue. The problem with there are cases where, for example, look, we want to send some trucks or biscuits to Afghanistan. Pakistan doesn't let it go through you have to go through Iran. But this grand vision of Iran is a gateway on map, yes. But if you have a government that's going to look into every container to see how many bottles of Johnny Walker might be there, Iran is not Singapore. Iran is not a trading nation. That while lines on map look good, Iran is got Bolshevik mullahs, so they're not in the open trading business. So you have a fundamental problem of how Iran can actually serve as a corridor. But the fact is, we want to keep that option open that in Afghanistan you need Iran. Tomorrow Taliban comes back to power. How do you deal with that situation? So that's the only thing that keeps. But I don't think India is going to sacrifice itself for the sake of Iran, whatever much the pressures. There are people who say India should be doing that. Defending Iran is more important than defending India's interests. But then hopefully they're in a minority at this point. On Nepal, you should ask the leading expert on Nepal, is sitting right here. You can't get a better person to answer that question. But in terms of what you said about South Asia, I think Amitabh is left, Professor Amitabh. The idea of a South Asian economic, eventually a security community. That, as I said, look, on peacekeeping operations we do so much, but we still don't have one where even India, Bangladesh and Nepal can say that, look, all three of us contribute so much, so why don't we pool our experiences or resources? So eventually I would say, I love the idea that, look, you must restore the strategic unity of the subcontinent and the unity of purpose. At some point when you're economically integrated, you do the economic community. Someday, I think the security community is possible. And our history, for example, that there are, even the army was a united army, and they're much, next year is going to be the 100th anniversary of the World War I. In 2014, can we do something India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, saying, look, so I think there are possibilities, but I would say India should be actively interested in promoting that notion, but on a careful basis, not saying that we're going to take over everybody around us. Yeah, that organization is called Indian Ocean Rim, Indian Ocean, Association for Regional Cooperation. It's being revived, actually. India is now the chairman, it's just taken over. We're going to be, I think there's a lot of interest because once China started showing up in Indian Ocean, I think it's woken us up. That earlier we were very skeptical of the Australians trying to meddle in and say, look, we're running this Indian Ocean framework. But now we're working closely with Australians. We're looking forward to Singapore, Oman. I think 2 years India, 2 years Australia. We're going to have a 4-year period where we're going to push Indian Ocean and regional cooperation.
Yes.
Well, thanks very much for the interesting presentation. In your presentation, you have one segment on the historical context, Indian expeditionary forces in a large variety of countries. If we look at the population size of various nations, obviously India and China are right at the top. So India and China, the relationship between them is obviously going to be a very, very major issue for the whole world. And so I'm just wondering whether you could touch a little bit on this, particularly from a historical perspective. Now, not being a scholar in this field, this is from occasional reading and so on, we get the impression that if you ask the Japanese where did karate come from, they said, oh, from China. I think it's in the book I founded karate in Japan. But if you ask the Chinese where did Chinese kung fu come from, they said because there was this Indian monk who came over, and then they credited it to the Indians. So I found it to be quite interesting. And also, I think there were a few monks who went over to India, right, to fetch the Buddhist scriptures. So there seems to be a very long history of contact between the two, And so I'm just wondering how, when we look back, because of the rising economic might of China, might not it be interesting to also look at a period of time in history, in the Tang Dynasty, for instance, in which economically at that time, I think China was probably right up there.
What is the question?
So the question is this. At that time, there seemed to be quite a friendly, interchange between the two countries, right? And is that going to be an indication of what's going to happen in the future? I mean, like in investments, there's always this declaration that past performance is no guarantee of future performance. So, could you comment a little bit on that, please?
Kanti?
Raj, I mean, the kind of historical background and drawing the parallels and all of that, it was fascinating. But I'm just trying to think of real, actual missions or scenarios that India might conceivably deal with in the future. And I'm finding it a bit difficult to figure out what those might be. On the energy front, whatever regimes may, however radical, may come to power in the Gulf, let's say, at the end of the day, they can't drink that oil. They've got to sell it, and they'll sell it just like the Iranians sold it or anybody else. So I'm not sure that there's ever going to be a very serious need for the Indian Navy, let's say an Indian expeditionary force to go in there to release the oil, and in any case, somebody else is probably going to do it faster than us, and maybe better than us, regardless. In terms of any kind of a coalition against the willing, against a China that's pushing its weight around a little too much, seems a bit fantastic. Either the Americans will have enough sufficient power, especially with the Japanese, which is a pretty respectable navy, by the way, or else it really won't matter. I mean, Indian ships pushing up to the South China Sea is a long haul, and we'd be extremely vulnerable. And the gap between India and China is on the ratio of 5:1 in terms of GDP today. So that, any notion, I mean, you were saying the notion of India and Pakistan having any kind of parity. In India and China too, in terms of any real kind of parity, seems very, very distant. So the idea that we would be involved in any kind of real mission on behalf of Southeast Asians or anybody else in that region seems pretty fantastic too. I mean, if you really think about it, then the only thing I can come up with is protecting overseas Indians in certain parts of the world if they're really, if they're being tyrannized and oppressed and hurt and maimed and brutalized, which is perhaps a fairly old imperial almost obligation, but today it would be talked about differently. A second is piracy. I mean, that's a real public good issue, and it's also something that could affect Indian-born trade. A third mission is, of course, disaster management, a humanitarian mission to go out there. Fourth, there might be, of course, the old Blue Hats role, which again is an old public good mission. I can't really think of too many other, I mean, help restore order in the Maldives and so on. We could have done that 40 years ago. I can still do it. So I guess I'm a bit puzzled, curious about what we would really be doing. I mean, there are ideas at the basis for doing something, there are capabilities being built up, but really, you wonder whether there's anything very substantial to do. The second point, I mean, goes back somewhat to Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry's question about, and you mentioned the word capability. At the end of the day, if you do really want to do stuff, very ambitiously and long-term beyond your shores, you need your own military capability, surely. And we don't produce a single important platform of any kind. You know, in the end, otherwise, your military power projection is hostage to your suppliers. And if that's the case, then you're almost back to being a colonial army. I mean, the Europeans, the Americans, and so on supply us arms, and then we go out and do various things. Sometimes on their behalf, sometimes not. But in the end, we're hostage to the supplies they give us, right down to the ammunition. I mean, the only military platform we can produce today are nuclear bombs and long-range missiles, basically. There's nothing else of any substance. So I wonder, you know, even if you can sketch in power projection needs for the future, what's the ability when there's really no domestic arms industry of any sophistication? And, or do you see any change therein? I mean, is there something building up there that might make us a genuine power projecting capable state?
Yeah. India's military diplomacy with Southeast Asia. There seems to be, the picture that is painted is India is very welcome to most Southeast Asian countries and military cooperation is increasing. I just wanted your confirmation of this and are all Southeast Asian countries enthusiastically going with Indian military cooperation with India, or are there reservations, for example, in Indonesia? And if they are going ahead, what is the main driver? China? And I had a supplementary question that is China's military diplomacy will be increasing. They are late starter, but
they do it a lot better. They do it a lot better than
how do you see serious competition developing?
Surya?
So there was some mention of a possible scenario of a forward military presence in the Indian Ocean area, at least. Will not be an old-style deployment scenario, or could there be something new like networking with countries which matter in that region suitably, so that you don't have to deploy too much of your own forces?
Anyone else?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I know you're tremendous amount. Just one thing I'd like your comment on. The border disputes between China and India, what are they all about? I mean, is there something real that can be resolved, or is it something that allows the two countries to put off resolving things while they're finding their place in the world?
In this military diplomacy debate, there really is no debate in the political system on this issue. It's a debate between the joint secretaries and maybe the army and the ruling party of the time. So I mean, in a way, the ruling party has a complete freedom of to decide this, because this never comes in a debate. Even the regular diplomacy doesn't come in a debate, other than I mean online or not, and we still stick to that. So there is no debate, public debate on it, other than some think tanks will talk about it right now. So it is, we do not have a debate in Parliament on this issue ever. I don't think it's ever come into a situation other than, shall we send troops with the blue hat on or whatever. That's all. So is there going to be a real political debate on this issue, or are we going to just have it in the realms of the think tanks?
I think just the first question on China, I think it's a very good question. Chinese are, like always, they simplify and put it in a nice way of explaining it to everyone. If you look back at our history, 99% good, 1% bad. That barring one incident of with 59, barring the 59-62 period, there's no record of conflict between India and China. It's been generally a positive story. But if you go a little deeper than that, and you say, look, actually there was no contact. That Professor Tan Sen Sen has done this work on India-China trade. Post 11th and 12th centuries, the contact between the two sides completely disappeared. So part of the problem today is India and China don't know each other, don't understand each other, have no sense of how the other side works. So what travels actually a huge gap of awareness of the other. But what is happening? Good is there's going to be there's going to be an explosion of economic growth and contact between the two sides. I mean, Mr. Vijay Pandey can tell you what's happening in the IT sector. That actually, from almost $2 billion in 2000, it's hit $72 billion last year. it's going to hit, by 2013, I think it'll be $100 billion. So the sheer, these are the second and third largest economies, the sheer size of their economies is going to produce an interaction, the scale of which we're not going to see in the world before. I think it is still at the very bottom of the curve, but Indians are figuring out, chaps who don't know anything about China fly in, they know where to buy cheap goods, try and run away without paying them probably once in a while. That the scale of exchanges at the popular level too is dramatically growing. So I think we're just beginning on an exciting contact between the two societies. Now there are problems, there's a boundary issue, there is a whole lot of other issues, there's deep suspicion, and because China is in Tibet, there is this whole question of both of our territoriality today, India's territoriality or China's territoriality, depends on the grace of the other, whether it's Kashmir or Tibet, that it is not automatically you can say, look, our territoriality is complete, it's not. So I think we're locked in a situation, but my sense is the weight, going back again to the Chinese analogy, if the positive keeps growing, the salience of the negative will go down. And then we can manage this issue, because at this point, we started out 10 years ago saying, look, we must solve the boundary dispute. I think we've reached a point today, okay, you must do, both engage that issue as well as expand economic cooperation. But it's a very unique border, because we don't even agree on where we are. With Pakistan, at least we have a line of control which demarcated on the map and saying, look, here is the line of control with every single coordinate defined. With Pakistan, with China, we don't, it's called line of actual control, which means we don't actually know where we are. It's a huge, complete mess on that border. But I think what the two sides have shown the maturity to manage it so far. So I think if the balance of power keeps shifting in Chinese favor, I think the Chinese will have less incentive to do a settlement. But if things go the other way, like what we've seen in the last 2 years, China is still a problem controlling Tibet. How do you stop somebody from killing themselves, which is what's going on in Tibet? That 14% growth rate of the last 20 years is still not solved. Similarly, India has problems in Kashmir, India has problems in the northeast. So at some point, I think there will be reason for both of them to settle. But meanwhile, the positive, the exchanges, the commerce, the interaction of the people, that is dramatically growing. So I think, but it's a story, I think, if you look at the last 60 years, the defining image of India-China is, what is that book's name? Protracted Contest. But that book was written before the economic cooperation started. Today, I think you're in a different situation. So I think this is a story that will be central for the evolution of Asia, it will be central for the world. How that plays out, and I don't think we can make judgments on the basis of our experience in the past, but this much, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. I think, Kanti, many of your points, I think, what missions, so people is one thing, that you saw for the first time, Indian and the Chinese ships were the first to show up in the Libyan ports. Chinese had to vacate 35,000 people. India had to vacate 18,000 people. That mission, previously we used to just say, look, we can't do much. We could do in Iraq and Gulf, but this was going to the Mediterranean. The Indian Navy and the Chinese Navy went to the Mediterranean. In fact, the first time Chinese Navy ever showed up in Mediterranean to come and pull out the troops. No, that's only one example. Now, Maldives, tomorrow, I'll just give you one example. Tomorrow, if Seychelles, Delhi suspects there's been a coup that's been organized, which is going to remove all my facilities and bring in somebody else's. I'm going to make a phone call to the United Nations Security Council and say, multilateralism, you're going to do all this stuff. Or I ask my American friends and say, look, can you help us a bit here? So I think there could be conditions where your stakes are rising. I think the change from the past is the scale of dependence today on the Indian Ocean sea lanes. For the Chinese has grown. And because Chinese are coming, the Indian concerns have grown. But the Chinese are vulnerable, just as India is vulnerable in the Pacific. Chinese are vulnerable because you have to come through the Malacca Strait, the so-called Malacca Dilemma, go all the way to Africa to get your stuff. So I think there are vulnerabilities for both. But if you tell them and say, look, why don't you rely on the market mechanism? All our American friends tell you that, look, they got to sell their oil. And don't be stupid and put your money into all these strange places. Let's rely on the market mechanism. Then the Indians and Chinese will ask the Americans, look, why do you have a special relationship with the House of South? If it was such a nice, happy market that's going to run this, why is it that you have a special, no. That's one point. The second point, the Indians and Chinese will say, look, can I depend on the Americans to do it always for me? Or or should I depend on, even if they're willing to do it. But it's a very interesting argument that's coming from Washington the last 2 months, which is American dependence on the Gulf oil has come down dramatically, while overall oil dependence has come down less, but they're getting more from west coast of Africa, Latin America, Canada, domestic production. So in fact, it's a lever for the Americans today, that the Indians and the Chinese are stuck to the Gulf, while the Americans can actually leverage it in a very interesting ways. So I think it will be very different. In fact, there was an occasion when Indian minister told the Chinese, look, we'd like to help you secure the sea lanes. The Chinese said, no, thank you very much. We'll do that ourselves. We don't want somebody else to charity to protect my lifelines from the Indian. So I think as large powers, they're not going to depend on somebody else. The third point on capabilities, I think it's a very important point. I think anything with moving parts, it's been pretty difficult to build. The Chinese are doing a little better. They still haven't copied a Russian jet. They still can't produce a jet engine like the Americans or the French do. Indians are even way behind. But I think on some areas they're beginning to do things. Like the Chinese are building and designing their own aircraft carrier. India is doing it now. 2 aircraft carriers are going to design and build. Some stuff is beginning to happen. The third, I think, is absence of indigenous industrial capability will always be a weakness if you want to become a major power. You need to be self-reliant in your industrial production. But there is an opportunity today, I think, which is different from the previous 30 years, because the West is broke. That you can squeeze out the French, winner takes it all, and winners get squeezed all. That there is a leverage today that India and China have of being able to extract things which you could not get before.
It's called the winner's curse.
Yeah, winner's curse. Like the Chinese, what are the Chinese telling the Europeans? Okay, you want us to bail you out? What about that little arms embargo these Americans force you to have it against us? Why you, 1989, Tiananmen, who cares? Now why you have this? Because the Americans say, look, you do that, my balance of power will go. But I think there is an interesting dynamic here, that the increasing leverage of China and India will give them options to extract technology, industrial production, joint ventures. What we see happen in the rest of the industrial field, if you're smart, I think the Chinese are smarter than Indians, so policy-wise, that they can extract this faster, like they've done in the high-speed trains, like they've done on so many fields. It is possible, I think, you should be able to create an industrial infrastructure that will produce, yeah. Then on the Southeast Asian issue, I think the complaint I hear from Southeast Asians is, look, India is not doing enough. That India must do more. That Indonesia, we have actually an MOU that was approved by the parliament, which normally the parliament is pretty tough. That there are agreements that are signed with most countries that today India is not able to fully implement on industrial production, on defense cooperation, on servicing. That I think the problem is not the lack of welcome, but India is still a fat slob. You've got to drag this guy out, and it's a slow process, but it's something that India can only learn over a period of time. But the opportunities do exist. I think I answered you. Yeah, I think
talking about the opposition.
Yeah, the 2 points. Yeah, Surya's point. Look, I think it's always that India will actually be a threat to China. When somebody raises the question, only if India is in a coalition. That on its own, India cannot threaten the US in the Pacific. But if India sitting with Japan and the US, then you know how to get out. That actually, the Chinese, if you look at the Chinese writings, what they're saying is that, look, in India, US can blockade, distant blockade. I don't think it's possible, but at least theoretically, you can say.
It's mutual encirclement. Yeah. That's why they're so interested in Pakistan.
So it is a question of whether we operate in a coalition. That takes back to the original dilemma, that look, are you prepared to enter a coalition with the United States and Japan? Or do you want to play it alone? So I think the moment India combines its strength, and I think that deals with the question of gap that Kanchi raised, that Pakistan is a threat to us not because of themselves, but because of the alliance with China or the United States. That in India that pools its resources, or external balances, as you guys will say, then it's a different game. Then I think the dynamic will change in terms of the equality and parity issues. On the question of the, the Delhi, the policy is finally made by a small group of people. For a large country, the foreign policy making is pretty narrow base. I don't see that changing. So the debates are, when we talk about debates, these debates are only going to be in a very narrow circle, which are amplified a little bit by the media and the think tanks. But I think the pressure, I think, that is coming on them, like until recently, for example, they were not letting the private sector come into the defense manufacturing. But today, they just now, newspapers, one of the reports said that, look, there's pressure for them to align, open up JVs. So I think the logic of what Kanti was saying, that look, the pressure that the Chinese power is radiating at you, whether you fight with the Chinese or not, even if you cooperate with them, the pressure on you to reform your core security structures, that pressure is building. And I think however slow we are, we still do respond a little bit, so that produces the outcomes that.
Thank you, Raja. I think we all agree that we have had a very good discussion. I think the last 5 policy dilemmas which you mentioned, I have a feeling that they would gradually melt away, and they will melt away and probably drive India's military diplomacy, depending on 2 critical factors which have come out through the discussion. One is, of course, India's security stakes, and that would answer many of the points which Kanti raised. For instance, India would have missions if there are security stakes. You don't have a mission for having the sake of the mission, unless you really want to dominate a certain region or a certain area. India is neither capable, nor perhaps so far it is into the foreign policy ideology or philosophy that you carry out missions just to show your flag. And unless there are stakes, I think it would be difficult. And these are the stakes which have perhaps helped evolve the military diplomacy in one way or the other. And the second, again, is a point which was discussed, depending on the capabilities. I think India's defense sector is changing in some very slow but definite manners, like the participation of private sector. And that would probably change 2 things, which I know from my own knowledge, did not allow India to service and honor some of the defense agreements which we had signed earlier. And that would be one, besides administrative capability, your own capability to supply what people are expecting out of you, what they are aspiring from you. Secondly, whether you can really have your own surplus capacity to offer as a part of the military goodies. I know, countries in Southeast Asia, in South Asia have been asking India for the last 10 to 15 years all kind of items, but India simply cannot, being in the public sector production, you can't even meet the demands of your own forces to a manner. So you raised the point very rightly that if you can't do that, you cannot really have a very assertive, very aggressive, forward-looking military policy. So I think the 2 factors which would really drive are your own stakes and your capabilities. And if India, despite the aspirations, fail on these 2 counters, I think none of this policy will come out. Please give a hand to Raja. And we have some tea and snacks outside for you to come enjoy. Thank you very much.